An empath does not leave when they stop loving you. They leave when they stop believing that their love can heal what keeps hurting them. And the most dangerous moment is not when they scream, cry, or complain. It is when they become silent. People often believe that an empath becomes quiet overnight. They think the distance appeared suddenly, as if one argument, one disappointment, or one bad day caused the emotional withdrawal. But that is almost never the truth. The silence of an empath is a slow and invisible process that begins long before anyone notices it. It is built quietly through accumulated emotional wounds, repeated disappointments, and moments where their feelings were ignored, dismissed, or taken for granted. By the time an empath finally stops speaking, they have already spent countless nights fighting internal battles nobody knew existed. An empath does not wake up one morning and decide to emotionally disconnect from someone they deeply care about. In fact, they are usually the kind of people who fight the hardest to preserve relationships. They give more chances than most people would. They try to understand behavior that hurts them. They excuse coldness, forgive neglect, and tolerate emotional inconsistency because they always search for the pain behind people's actions. They naturally believe that if someone hurts others, there must be an unhealed wound inside that person. This way of thinking makes empaths incredibly compassionate, but it also makes them vulnerable to staying in situations that slowly destroy them emotionally. At first, the empath speaks openly about what hurts them. They communicate carefully because they do not want conflict. They explain their emotions with patience, hoping honesty will strengthen the connection rather than damage it. They may say things like, "I just want to feel appreciated," or "I feel distant from you lately." These are not complaints meant to attack someone. They are emotional invitations asking to be understood. The empath is trying to save the relationship before the emotional damage becomes too deep. But when those conversations are repeatedly ignored, minimized, mocked, or turned against them, something painful begins happening internally. The empath slowly learns that expressing emotions no longer feels safe. That realization changes everything. Instead of feeling heard, they begin feeling like a burden. Instead of feeling emotionally protected, they begin feeling emotionally exposed. Every time they try to communicate and are met with indifference, defensiveness, or emotional absence, a small part of them retreats inward, not dramatically, quietly. They begin observing more and speaking less. They start questioning whether their emotions matter at all. They replay conversations in their mind, wondering if they asked for too much when all they truly wanted was emotional reciprocity. Most people fail to notice this stage because the empath still appears present. They still answer messages. They still smile. They still fulfill responsibilities. But internally, exhaustion has already started building. The empath begins carrying emotional loneliness inside relationships that once felt safe. And emotional loneliness is one of the heaviest forms of pain because it happens while physically standing beside someone who no longer truly sees you. As time passes, the empath becomes quieter, not because they no longer care, but because they are becoming emotionally tired of repeating the same pain. They recognize patterns that others ignore. They notice how their kindness is expected but rarely returned. They notice how they are always the one trying to repair emotional distance. They notice how their understanding is consumed endlessly while their own emotional needs remain unmet. These realizations do not create immediate anger. They create sadness, deep sadness that slowly transforms into emotional withdrawal. What makes this silence so misunderstood is that it does not arrive with visible drama. Empaths rarely announce the exact moment they begin emotionally shutting down. Instead, they become calmer. They stop arguing over things that once mattered deeply to them. They stop explaining every feeling. They stop asking for reassurance. To outsiders, this can look like maturity or emotional stability, but often it is the beginning of emotional surrender. The empath is no longer trying with the same intensity because part of them has already accepted the painful possibility that nothing will truly change. Inside their mind, a silent question keeps growing louder. How many times can someone explain their pain before they finally become silent? An empath does not lose their kindness all at once. The transformation happens slowly, almost invisibly, through emotional exhaustion that builds over months or even years. Most people imagine exhaustion as something physical, something visible in tired eyes or a weakened body. But emotional exhaustion is different. It lives deep inside the mind and heart, draining a person's spirit little by little until even simple emotional interactions begin to feel heavy. For an empath, this kind of exhaustion becomes especially dangerous because they naturally absorb the emotions, problems, and energy of the people around them. They do not simply witness pain, they internalize it. At the beginning, an empath often believes they can handle everything. They become the emotional support system for everyone around them. Friends come to them with heartbreak, family members unload stress onto them, and partners rely on them for constant emotional reassurance. The empath listens patiently because helping others feels natural to them. They genuinely want people to feel safe, understood, and emotionally accepted. They carry conversations that others avoid. They stay awake comforting people through emotional crises. They sacrifice their own peace to make sure someone else feels less alone. And while everyone praises their compassion, very few stop to ask who is comforting the empath in return. This imbalance creates invisible emotional pressure. Empaths are often surrounded by people who love receiving emotional support but struggle to provide it back. Over time, the empath begins existing in relationships where they are valued more for what they give than for who they are. Their kindness becomes expected, their patience becomes assumed, their emotional availability becomes something others feel entitled to. The empath slowly becomes the emotional caretaker of every relationship while silently neglecting their own emotional needs. What makes emotional exhaustion so destructive is that it changes behavior in ways people misunderstand. The empath who was once warm and endlessly patient starts becoming distant. They take longer to reply to messages. They avoid emotionally draining conversations. They spend more time alone. People may accuse them of becoming cold, selfish, or detached, but the truth is far more painful. The empath is not becoming heartless. They are becoming emotionally overwhelmed. There is a limit to how much emotional weight one person can carry without collapsing internally. When an empath continuously gives without receiving emotional safety in return, their nervous system begins protecting itself. They stop engaging with the same emotional intensity because every interaction starts feeling draining rather than fulfilling. Conversations that once energized them now exhaust them. Situations they once tolerated now feel unbearable. They become sensitive to emotional dishonesty, manipulation, and superficial connections because exhaustion removes their ability to keep pretending everything is fine. This is why emotionally exhausted empaths often withdraw suddenly from environments or people they once deeply invested in. It is not impulsive behavior, it is accumulated fatigue finally reaching its breaking point. They become tired of always understanding others while nobody tries to understand them. Tired of explaining emotions to people committed to misunderstanding them. Tired of carrying relationships that survive only because they continue pouring energy into them. One of the saddest parts of emotional exhaustion is that empaths often hide it extremely well. They continue functioning while silently deteriorating inside. They may still smile in public, still fulfill obligations, still appear emotionally stable on the surface. But internally, they feel disconnected from themselves. The emotional burnout becomes so severe that even small disappointments begin affecting them deeply because their emotional reserves are already depleted. As exhaustion grows, the empath changes in subtle but powerful ways. They become quieter in conversations where they once spoke openly. They stop offering advice unless asked. They stop chasing emotional closeness with people who repeatedly create distance. They begin protecting their time, energy, and emotional space with greater intensity because they finally realize nobody else will protect it for them. What once looked like unlimited emotional availability now becomes careful emotional boundaries. At first, the empath tries to fix what is broken. They approach problems with emotional honesty, hoping that clarity will bring improvement. They carefully choose words, avoiding blame and focusing instead on feelings, hoping the other person will understand the emotional impact of their behavior. They do not accuse, they explain. They do not attack, they reveal vulnerability. But when these attempts are met with indifference, defensiveness, or temporary change that never lasts, the empath begins shifting inward. They start questioning not only the relationship, but also their own emotional expectations. They wonder whether they are asking for too much simply because they desire consistency, respect, and emotional presence. This stage of suffering is particularly dangerous because it is silent. The empath continues to function in the relationship while gradually losing emotional safety. They still show up, they still respond, they still care, but something inside them begins to withdraw piece by piece. Each unmet need adds another layer of emotional fatigue. Each dismissed feeling creates another internal wound, and yet they rarely express the full extent of their pain because they fear being misunderstood or labeled as overly sensitive. So instead of escalating conflict, they lower their expectations. They begin accepting less, not because they want less, but because they are exhausted from asking for more. As this pattern continues, the empath enters a state of emotional overextension. They are constantly giving, constantly understanding, constantly adjusting themselves to maintain peace in the relationship. Meanwhile, their own emotional needs remain unaddressed. This imbalance creates a quiet inner collapse that is not visible to others. The empath may appear stable, even supportive, but internally they are carrying emotional weight that has become too heavy to sustain. They start to feel isolated even in the presence of the people they care about most. This emotional isolation is one of the most painful experiences for an empath because it creates the feeling of being unseen while still being physically close. The suffering deepens when the empath realizes a painful pattern. Their emotional absence is often noticed only when they start giving less. When they are fully present, emotionally available, and constantly supportive, their presence is taken for granted. But the moment they begin withdrawing slightly, people suddenly notice the change. This realization creates a quiet internal conflict. The empath begins to understand that their emotional labor has been sustaining the connection more than mutual care has. This awareness does not lead to immediate departure, but it begins weakening their emotional attachment. Even at this stage, the empath does not leave easily. They continue trying, not because they are unaware of the imbalance, but because they hope that understanding will eventually be matched with change. They endure emotional inconsistency, broken promises of improvement, and cycles of temporary affection followed by emotional neglect. Each cycle reinforces the internal truth they are slowly accepting but not yet fully ready to face. They begin grieving the relationship while still being inside it, preparing emotionally for a separation they have not yet physically made. What makes this suffering so profound is that it is not visible to the outside world. To others, the empath may still look involved, still engaged, still present, but internally, they are already beginning to detach in stages, slowly disconnecting from expectations that once defined their emotional investment, gradually moving toward a place where silence starts feeling safer than expression. There is a moment in every empath's emotional journey that carries more meaning than any argument, any confrontation, or any visible separation. It is not loud, and it does not come with final declarations. It happens quietly, almost invisibly when the empath stops explaining how they feel. Until that point, they have spent a significant part of their emotional energy trying to make themselves understood. They have translated their emotions into words, carefully shaped sentences to avoid blame, and repeated their inner experiences in hopes that clarity would eventually lead to change. But when explanation no longer feels useful, something fundamental shifts inside them. At first, explaining is their way of preserving connection. They believe that misunderstanding is the root of emotional distance, so they try to bridge it with communication. They describe their feelings with precision, often overthinking every word so that it does not sound harsh or accusatory. They revisit conversations in their mind, wondering if they expressed themselves clearly enough, if they chose the right tone, if they should try again in a different way. This process can repeat many times, especially when the empath still believes the relationship has potential for healing. They do not explain because they enjoy it. They explain because they hope it will help others see what they see so clearly. However, over time, something begins to change. The empath notices a pattern where their explanations do not lead to real understanding. Instead, they are often met with defensiveness, temporary adjustments, or emotional dismissal. Sometimes their feelings are acknowledged briefly but not truly absorbed. Other times, they are reframed, minimized, or turned into something easier for the other person to avoid dealing with. Each of these experiences slowly erodes the empath's motivation to continue expressing themselves, not because they stop having emotions, but because they begin to see that their emotions are not being met with equal emotional responsibility. The turning point arrives quietly. It is not marked by a single event, but by accumulated emotional fatigue. The empath starts noticing that explaining feels repetitive rather than meaningful. The same concerns, the same patterns, the same disappointments are being voiced again and again without real transformation. At this stage, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The emotional cost of explaining becomes higher than the emotional relief it provides. Instead of feeling heard after expressing themselves, they begin feeling drained. Instead of feeling closer to the other person, they feel further away. So they begin to reduce their explanations. At first, they shorten their words. Then they stop repeating themselves. Eventually, they stop initiating emotional conversations altogether. This silence is not born from indifference. It is born from recognition. The empath begins to understand that communication alone is not enough when emotional reciprocity is missing. They realize that explaining feelings to someone who consistently fails to respond with genuine understanding is no longer a form of connection, but a form of emotional exhaustion. What makes this stage so significant is that it often goes unnoticed by the other person. They may still assume everything is fine because the empath is no longer expressing dissatisfaction. They interpret the absence of explanation as peace rather than withdrawal. But internally, the empath is no longer engaging in emotional negotiation. They have already gone through the process of trying, hoping, adjusting, and enduring. What remains is a quiet acceptance that their emotional voice is no longer being met with the care it requires. The empath does not become silent out of sudden decision. They become silent after realizing that their words no longer change anything. They stop explaining not because they have nothing left to say, but because they no longer believe that saying it will make a difference. This is where emotional disengagement begins to solidify. The relationship may still exist in form, but the emotional effort that once sustained it is no longer being invested in the same way. The empath begins conserving their emotional energy for themselves rather than distributing it endlessly towards someone who has stopped meeting them halfway. When an empath becomes silent, people often misinterpret the shift as punishment. From the outside, it can look like emotional withdrawal designed to create guilt, distance, or discomfort in others. But this interpretation misses the deeper truth of what is actually happening internally. An empath does not usually operate from a place of revenge because revenge requires emotional energy, attachment, and a desire to control outcomes. By the time an empath reaches silence, they are no longer investing energy into emotional retaliation. They are investing whatever remains of their emotional strength into protecting what is left of themselves. Silence, for an empath, is not an active decision to hurt others. It is a passive necessity born from emotional depletion. It is the final stage of self-preservation after repeated cycles of giving, understanding, forgiving, and overextending. The empath does not arrive at silence because they want to teach someone a lesson. They arrive there because they have already learned too many painful lessons themselves. Every ignored feeling, every dismissed concern, every moment of emotional invalidation accumulates quietly until the internal system that once processed everything with openness begins to shut down for survival. At this stage, something fundamental changes in how the empath relates to emotional expression. Earlier, they believed that communication could repair almost anything. They invested deeply in explaining their feelings, believing that clarity would lead to mutual understanding. But after enough repeated disappointment, they begin to recognize that not every emotional gap can be bridged by explanation alone. Some people hear emotions but do not absorb them. Some acknowledge feelings but do not adjust behavior. Some listen but do not change. This realization does not make the empath bitter. It makes them cautious. Silence becomes a boundary, not a weapon. It is the point where the empath decides that further emotional exposure will only lead to more exhaustion. They begin to conserve energy that was previously spent on trying to be understood. Instead of pouring themselves into conversations that feel increasingly one-sided, they start withdrawing into internal reflection. They observe more and reveal less. They respond instead of initiate. They participate without overcommitting emotionally. This shift can appear sudden to those around them, but internally it is the result of a long and gradual collapse of emotional trust. What others often fail to understand is that empaths do not turn silent while still feeling emotionally safe. They become silent precisely because emotional safety has been lost repeatedly. Each time their vulnerability was ignored or misunderstood, a small part of their willingness to stay emotionally open diminished. Over time, this creates a protective barrier that forms naturally without conscious effort. The empath is not trying to punish anyone by building this barrier. They are simply trying to prevent further emotional harm from entering a system that has already been overstimulated for too long. This self-protection is not coldness. It is exhaustion combined with awareness. The empath begins to understand that continuing to express pain in environments that do not respond to it only deepens the injury. So silence becomes a form of emotional shielding. It is the only available option that does not require them to keep sacrificing their own stability for the sake of maintaining external comfort. In silence, they find a limited but necessary form of relief from emotional overstimulation. Even in silence, the empath may still care deeply, but care alone is no longer enough to sustain engagement. They begin to separate emotional attachment from emotional access. They can still feel, but they no longer express freely to those who have consistently failed to hold their emotions with care. This is where misunderstanding often grows. Others may interpret distance as intentional coldness, when in reality it is the outcome of repeated emotional overexposure without protection or balance, and the empath standing at the threshold of complete emotional withdrawal, choosing not to re-enter spaces where their sensitivity was repeatedly overwhelmed, choosing instead to remain in a quieter internal space where fewer emotional demands exist, where less explaining is required, where fewer expectations press against their already limited emotional reserves. There is a stage in the emotional life of an empath that is rarely understood in real time and often only recognized in hindsight. It is not the moment they leave physically, nor the moment they stop speaking. It is the moment they disconnect emotionally. This internal separation happens long before any visible distance appears. Outwardly, they may still be present, still responding, still fulfilling responsibilities, still maintaining a level of interaction that suggests continuity. But internally, the emotional bond that once made them deeply engaged has already begun to dissolve. This disconnection is not sudden and it is not impulsive. It is the result of a long accumulation of emotional fatigue, unmet needs, and repeated experiences of being emotionally unseen. When an empath is still emotionally connected, they are highly invested in the relationship's emotional outcomes. They interpret details deeply, they care about emotional shifts, and they remain sensitive to even small changes in tone, behavior, or presence. Their emotional system is fully engaged, constantly processing and trying to maintain harmony. However, when that system becomes overloaded for too long without relief or reciprocity, something essential begins to shut down as a form of self-preservation. The empath does not stop caring instantly, but they begin to stop investing in the same emotional depth they once naturally offered. Their internal world starts to detach itself from the external emotional demands placed upon them. This emotional disconnection is often invisible to others at first. The empath may still appear calm, composed, and even cooperative. They continue interacting because they are used to being responsible, reliable, and considerate. But the internal emotional energy that once fueled their engagement is no longer flowing in the same way. Conversations that once triggered emotional reflection begin to feel distant. Situations that once evoked strong emotional responses begin to feel muted. The empath is no longer emotionally participating at the same level, even though they are still physically present. The most critical misunderstanding at this stage is that people often assume things can easily return to how they were. They believe that reassurance, apologies, or temporary changes in behavior can reverse the distance. But what they fail to see is that the empath has already gone through a long internal process of processing disappointment, adjusting expectations, and slowly detaching in order to protect their emotional well-being. By the time emotional disconnection has fully set in, the empath has already experienced the relationship from every emotional angle they were capable of enduring. There is very little internal uncertainty left. What remains is clarity, and that clarity often leads to emotional finality. Once this internal finality is reached, attempts to re-establish emotional closeness become significantly more difficult. This is not because the empath becomes stubborn or unwilling, but because their emotional system no longer responds with the same openness it once did. Emotional trust, once stretched and repeatedly strained, does not automatically regenerate through words alone. It requires consistent, sustained, emotional safety over time, something that is rarely offered at the point when disconnection has already occurred. As a result, the empath begins to observe interactions without the same emotional attachment. They may still understand what is being said, but they are no longer emotionally moved by it in the same way.